So I am a massive Lord of the Rings fan. I watch the trilogy quite literally weekly. I've read the books, as well as The Hobbit, The Silmarillion, The Fall of Numenor. I've got figures, posters, Lego, you name it, I've got it. So I've been desperate for a good Lord of the Rings game. And with the release of Lord of the Rings Gollum, I can safely say I'm still waiting. I mean, it just took one look at the gameplay trailers to know it would suck. And although if I was making a Lord of the Rings game, Gollum would never be the protagonist, I was pretty interested to see Gollum's story and what happens in the time between him losing a ring to Bilbo and the start of the Lord of the Rings. But the entire game disappointed and just left me wanting more. And I will be going over the entire game in this video, so spoiler warning. Now let's just talk about the Oliphant in the room, Gollum himself. I mean, he's just terrible, isn't he? He looks like an incredibly skinny 10-year-old child. His voice did grow on me slightly, but it's just awful. And his face is so weird. I mean, Gollum looked creepy anyway, but the way his face moves and how it's animated just looks so stupid. And that's not even just limited to Gollum. Pretty much every NPC will look awful and have weird and clunky animations. Now, this game was made by a smaller team, so obviously had a smaller budget, but I don't think you need me to tell you that. I mean, there are some parts of the game that look quite nice, like some shots of the mountains in Mordor, and then sometimes in Mirkwood, but overall, graphically the game just isn't up to current standards. But the worst part about the game was actually playing it. It's incredibly boring and repetitive. You pretty much just sneak around enemies and climb stuff the entire time, and that's all. I've never been a fan of stealth games as they are really slow and I'm just too impatient, but thankfully you can run through a lot of the areas here since the AI is laughably bad. You can quite literally get spotted, run behind a table, move around for a few seconds, and the orc or elf or whoever will literally just give up, and it happens with every single enemy without fail. This game has a large emphasis on stealth, yet has the worst stealth AI I've ever seen. And there's no variety in enemies. You just have the standard orc or elf, and you get past it, no ways to shake up the gameplay loop, no difficulty, just the same thing over and over for the entire game. But surely the only other mechanic in this game is better, right? No, not in the slightest. The platforming and climbing sequences are fine, sure, but that's all. They never evolve, they never get harder. It's just the exact same button presses, ledges to hang on to, walls to run up for your whole playthrough. And I guess that's just my biggest problem with the game. I don't think this game is terrible, but it's not any good either. It's the same stale, boring experience from the minute you start until the final credits. There's no real enjoyment or engagement with the game, it's just the same thing start to finish. And this would at least be more tolerable if the actual story was good. But of course, fitting with the rest of the game, it's garbage. In the game, Gollum is hiding out in the mountains of Carafungal until he gets captured by the Nazgul in what was actually a really cool and tense part of the game. And then you're taken into Barad-dûr, which I have to say, and I hope I'm not the only one, but I thought it looked terrible. My first thoughts were genuinely that it looked like a Star Wars ship or a rocket or just some spacecraft. But anyway, Gollum is then tortured and then sent to the dungeons. And then you do some chores for a couple of hours, talking to some NPCs that you definitely won't care about. And you also have these conflicts with Gollum and Smeagol, and you have to choose an approach to a situation. Like, for example, I could blame something on a rude orc or a man you meet. And these choices seem pretty cool as you get to choose Gollum's side or Smeagol's and have to convince the other, but it would be much more impactful if the choices were actually interesting or you cared about the outcome. But anyway, after you meet someone called the Candle Man, who will be the main antagonist for the game, and he is so incredibly boring. He's just a generic evil guy with no lore relevance, which is odd why he is a villain choice when someone like the Mouth of Sauron is literally in the game too. But anyway, you talk with him, you get a bird, and then you meet a fat guy who, you guessed it, you won't care about in any way. And then you plan to escape with him, then he leaves you behind and you escape yourself. Then you meet back up with him and go into Shelob's tunnel. The Shelob's tunnel part was pretty cool. It was creepy and the chase scene with Shelob was very reminiscent of something from like Uncharted. But after that, you can choose to let Shelob kill the fat guy or save him, so you do the right thing and let him die, and then you escape. And that ends the first section of the game. The whole Mordor part is you get caught, do some chores, escape, with no fun gameplay to be had. Mordor was my most anticipated part of this game, seeing the Nazgul in the trailers and wanting to see Barad-dûr, but I was just left feeling empty. It was so boring, the people you meet aren't interesting in the slightest, and this is literally the first half of the game. The second half takes place in Mirkwood. You have been captured and thrown into Thranduil's dungeons and are let out by Gandalf. Then you get to run around the kingdom and end up helping this sus elf who is locked in a dungeon. You escape with her, she leaves you behind, and you are taken back to the dungeons. Now, obviously this is an incredibly brief overview of the game, but you really aren't missing anything important. It will just be things like talking to another useless NPC, or doing some of the climbing, or doing some stealth, or climbing, or talking to some other NPC, or more climbing. But anyway, in the end, orcs from Mordor attack Mirkwood looking for Gollum. You get caught alongside sus elf. You go into this place with this special power. You have a final standoff against Candle Guy, and then Gollum goes off. That's it. The entire game, 2 areas, climbing stuff, talking to people you have no care for, broken stealth, and just an overall incredibly tedious experience. And as I said, this game's whole problem is it's just so boring. You'd have more fun watching the Hobbit trilogy with the extended editions. I really wanted more actual lore in this game. More about Sauron, the Nazgul, Aragorn, hearing more about Gondor or the Shire. But what we got was references to better things while having to deal with people like the Candleman. And I think this game will affect people differently depending on how big a Lord of the Rings fan you are. As I was really intrigued since I wanted to know more about Gollum's story and what happened during this period. But ultimately, this style of game was not it. And hearing that this company are planning on a second Lord of the Rings title, I pray it strays far away from Gollum and hopefully something more exciting, and if not, then something more lore relevant and interesting. Like a few games I would love to see are something like Aragorn's time as a ranger, and maybe even a Souls-like. I mean, just imagine a game like Elden Ring taking place in Middle-earth. That would be incredible, although that will never happen. But that's going to do it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. And I'll see you in the next one.